So let's talk about the epidermis. So in this picture here, what we're looking at is a histological slide of skin. Okay? We can see both the epidermis and the dermis in this picture, but I want to concentrate on the area in the red box, which is the epidermis. Epidermis is the area shown in these red boxes, so we're going to concentrate on that area there. The picture over here on the side is an artist's rendition of the epidermis. And you can see that the epidermis has several distinct layers based on the way the artist has drawn this. And we will be talking about these different layers of the epidermis. But first I want to talk about the cells that we find in the epidermis. So don't forget, I had mentioned previously that the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So stratified tells us it's many cell layers thick. Squamous tells us that if we look at the cells at the apex of this tissue, which would be the superficial side of the tissue, they are squished or flat in shape, right? And this is an epithelial tissue, hence epithelial cells. The epithelial cells found in the epidermis have a special name. They're called keratinocytes. They're called keratinocytes because they produce a protein called keratin. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So the majority of the cells that we find in the epidermis are these keratinocytes, but there are other cells found in the epidermis, including melanocytes, which produce melanin, which protects us from UV radiation, basal cells, which are a type of stem cell that helps us to produce more keratinocytes, Langerhans or dendritic cells, which are an immune system cell, which are important for detecting any bacteria or other pathogens that might be invading too deeply into the epidermis. And then there are also some, but not a lot, of sensory cells located in the epidermis. Most of the sensory cells of skin are located deeper in the dermis, but there are a few located in the epidermis. So I want to talk a little bit more about the tissue of the epidermis. So don't forget that tissues are just groups of similar cells working together for a function. So here we have epithelial cells known as keratinocytes that are forming stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and the main function here is protection. Like other epithelial tissues, the epidermis is avascular. Avascular means no blood vessels. So the epidermis has no blood vessels. Now, obviously, blood vessels are important for tissues and organs in the human body because they deliver oxygen and nutrients and water, and they remove waste from the tissue. There are blood vessels nearby to the epidermis in the superficial layers of the dermis, and that is how the epidermis will exchange things with the bloodstream, is through those blood vessels in the superficial region of the dermis. As I mentioned, the epidermis has specific layers, so the stratified epithelial tissue has distinct layers to it. There's 4 to 5 distinct layers of keratinocytes. Right? We have what we call thin skin and thick skin. So thick skin is only found on the palms of the hand, on the fingertips, and the soles of the feet, and thin skin is found everywhere else. So we have 4 layers in the epidermis of thin skin, and then 5 layers in the epidermis of thick skin. So as I mentioned, most of the cells here are keratinocytes. The keratinocytes are born, if you will, in the deepest layer of the epidermis. And then they're pushed towards the superficial surface of the epidermis by more cells being born below them, right? And it takes anywhere from 15 to 30 days to move a keratinocyte from the deepest layer to the most superficial layer. So basically, you replace your epidermis about every month. The names of the layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep are stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Stratum in Latin means layer. Right? So these are layers, and then each of the other words has a different meaning that we'll discuss in a moment. So we'll start with the most superficial layer, which is the stratum corneum. So corneum means horn in Latin, and the name comes from the fact that this layer is very tough, like the horn of an animal. A lot of people describe the stratum corneum as having a structure of brick and mortar. So basically this is telling you this was a pretty tough layer, right? What you have here are layers upon layers of dead keratinocytes. So these keratinocytes are dead, and they're surrounded by a mortar. So the keratinocytes are the brick, and they're surrounded by a mortar that's sticking them together, and the mortar is made of lipids and proteins and other compounds. These dead keratinocytes are shed into the environment, right? So this is one of the main contributors to dust in your house, right? This layer is very important for repelling water. So it has a nice waterproof component to it, and part of that comes from the lipids that are present there. And it also is very good at withstanding mechanical stresses, right? So it's just physically, mechanically protective. Just deep to the stratum corneum, you may or may not find the layer called the stratum lucidum. This is the layer that is only present in thick skin, right? So you will not find the stratum lucidum in thin skin, which is most of your body. Lucidum means clear, and if you look at the epidermis using a microscope without any staining, this layer appears very clear, hence the name. The stratum granulosum is next. So the stratum granulosum is found just deep to the stratum corneum in thin skin and just deep to the stratum lucidum in thick skin. The word granulosum is referring to granules that can be seen inside of the keratinocytes in this layer. So the keratinocytes in this layer are alive and about to die. The granules inside of these keratinocytes contain lipids and protein, like protein keratin. Okay? And eventually these cells die and they release these waterproofing lipids and this very mechanically stress-resistant keratin into the extracellular spaces between the other keratinocytes. In other words, in this layer, the keratinocytes are producing the mortar of the brick and mortar analogy. Just deep to the stratum granulosum is the stratum spinosum. Spinosum means spiny in Latin, and so some people thought when they looked at this with a microscope that it looked kind of like jaggedy and spiny, and that's where the name came from. This is the layer where the keratin starts to be produced. So in the previous layer, the stratum granulosum, I said keratin was being produced, but it actually started production in this layer here, the stratum spinosum. And that's actually what causes it to look spiny, is the production of the keratin. The deepest layer to the epidermis is called the stratum basale. Right? So this is the base or basement, if you will, of the epidermis. This is the layer that faces the next layer to skin called the dermis. Okay? In this layer, we find cells called basal cells. And basal cells are a type of stem cell, and they undergo mitosis, so they make more of themselves, and then some of those cells will differentiate and turn into keratinocytes. So this is how we make more keratinocytes, is by using these basal cell stem cells located in the stratum basale. Also in this layer, we might find some of those melanocytes that I mentioned, right? And we could find some of the other cell types I mentioned too, like maybe some sensory cells and maybe a Langerhans cell, that kind of thing. But most of the cells here are keratinocytes and basal cells. So I know these layers have funky sounding names, and if you are preparing to take a nursing exam like the Hesse exam, these layers of the epidermis are often on the exam. So this is kind of a good way to remember the names of these layers. Come, let's get sunburned, right? Come for corneum, let's for lucidum, get for granulosum, sun for spinosum, and burn for basale.